Okay, what we're going to talk about in this one is the horizontal line test. And it's a trick to tell us graphically whether or not a function has an inverse. First, remember that earlier in this chapter we talked about the vertical line test, which was if you have the graph of a function and you draw a vertical line anywhere on the graph, it can only cross, it cannot cross more than one spot. If it does, then it's not a function. Okay, that was the vertical line test. And just like everything else that we've done with functions, with inverse functions, everything's kind of the opposite. So now instead of a vertical line test, we look at a horizontal line test. And basically, if we have the graph of the original function, you look at it and see if there's any spots where the graph could get crossed more than once by a horizontal line. Because if it crosses more than once on a horizontal line, then an inverse does not exist. Yeah, and here it is. A function f has an inverse function if and only if no horizontal line intersects the graph at more than one point. All right, let's take a look at that. Here's a really simple example, something that you would probably look at and think to yourself, well, yeah, it's just a parabola. It's just an x squared function. Of course, it has an inverse. Well, you take a look at that horizontal line, and it's crossing through in two spots. Okay, that doesn't mean that it isn't a function. It means that there is no inverse to this particular function. All right. Why? Why is it that the square function doesn't have an inverse? All you do is you take the square root, right? If you take a look at what you would expect the inverse to be, it would look like that sideways parabola, and if you did the vertical line test on that sideways parabola, it would cross in two spots. So obviously, that sideways parabola does not represent the function. I've drawn a blue line on there that represents the line y equals x. And we're going to get to that more on the next video, but a graph and its inverse are reflections across that diagonal line that's y equals x. Okay, so the inverse of the sideways parabola fails a vertical line test, like I said. And if you also think about the fact that when you have y equals the square root of x, we know from earlier in this section that the graph of y equals the square root of x is just this piece of it. Okay, remember when we had that vertical line test that we were talking about, I had mentioned that technically you would have to use a plus or minus to get the two halves of that thing, and we don't have that bottom half, and that is why it's not it has no inverse. Sorry. All right. So the horizontal line test is just a simple way of showing on your original graph whether or not an inverse actually exists. That's all it's for. And the last thing I want to talk about in this one is referred to as one-to-one functions. And of course we have a formal definition that we're talking about here, but it's pretty simple and I'll explain it. A function f is one-to-one if each value of the dependent variable corresponds to exactly one value of the independent value. And a function f has an inverse if and only if it's one-to-one. All right, so what exactly does that mean in this context? Well, let's look at that parabola that we had before. All right, each value of the dependent variable, that's y, corresponds to exactly one of the independent. Okay, so the independent is the x-axis, the dependent is the y-axis. Here's a value on the y-axis, the dependent variable, and it has associated with it two spots, one there and one there. It's not one-to-one, and that's why it has no inverse. For that particular y value, there's actually two. So let's use an example of an actual one-to-one function. Let's say that I have a graph that looks like that. Okay, every single value of the independent, every single independent value. I keep messing this up. Every single dependent variable, every single dependent value has only one independent associated with it. So when I pick this y right there, it's associated with one x. If I pick this one here, it's associated with one x. That is a one-to-one function. And it's important to understand in the context of that horizontal line test that we took, there's nowhere on this graph that I can draw a horizontal line where it crosses more than once. Okay, so that tells you that it automatically has an inverse. And if we want to get nitpicky about it, that red function, there's only one place I can cross with a vertical line, so it itself is a function. But that's what it means to be a one-to-one. Okay, there's no basically there's no curving back onto itself. Okay, the x squared function that we talked about has a curve. It curves back up. If we have a cube function that goes like this, okay, that's not going to have an inverse to it because it curves right back on itself, not once but twice. Okay, so that's what's meant by the horizontal line test and the one-to-one function. And yeah, let's get out of here.